Imagine walking down the street, minding your own business, when suddenly flashing red and blue lights stop you in your tracks. A couple of officers step out, their faces unreadable. You haven't done anything wrong, but within moments, you're in handcuffs, confused and scared. Now, imagine this: you're disabled, and before you even get a chance to ask why you're being arrested, they take something you rely on every single day: your prosthetic leg. This is exactly what happened to one man, a regular guy just trying to live his life. But on this particular day, things took a turn he never expected. The officers claimed they had a reason, but their actions told a different story. He was left struggling, humiliated, and powerless against those who were supposed to protect him. What should have been a routine moment turned into a nightmare, one that would leave people questioning just how far some cops are willing to go when they abuse their power. But why did they do it? Was it a mistake, or something far more sinister? And most importantly, how did he fight back? Stick around, because this story is only getting started, and the truth behind this shocking arrest will leave you stunned. The man, whose name was Jake, had no idea why he was being stopped. He wasn't causing trouble, wasn't acting suspicious, just walking home like any other day. But as soon as the officers stepped out of their car, he could tell something was off. They weren't asking questions, they were making accusations. Before he could even speak, they had his hands behind his back, cuffing him like a criminal. Jake tried to stay calm. He asked what was going on, but the officers ignored him. Instead, they started patting him down, treating him like he was dangerous. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of them looked down at his prosthetic leg. Without hesitation, they yanked it off, leaving Jake struggling to stand. He gasped, not just from shock, but from the sheer humiliation. People on the street slowed down, watching in disbelief. A few pulled out their phones, recording what was happening. But the officers didn't seem to care. They tossed the prosthetic into their car like it was a piece of evidence. Jake's heart pounded. He had heard of cops abusing their power, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. What were they looking for? Did they think he was hiding something? And most importantly, how was he supposed to fight back when they had already taken away the one thing that kept him standing? Jake's mind raced as he struggled to keep his balance. The officers still hadn't given him a straight answer. He could feel the cold pavement pressing against his knee as he tried not to collapse. Around him, whispers grew louder. Bystanders were questioning what was happening, some shaking their heads, others pulling out their phones to record. Jake knew this wasn't right. He hadn't done anything. One of the officers, a tall man with a rigid stance, finally spoke. "We have reason to believe you're carrying contraband." Jake's stomach twisted. Contraband. In his prosthetic leg. That was ridiculous. He had worn it every day for years. There was nothing inside but the metal and plastic that helped him walk. His voice was steady, but his anger was rising. "That's insane. You can't just take my leg. I need it to walk." But the officers barely looked at him. They were too busy examining his prosthetic, turning it over like it was some hidden treasure chest. Jake's mind flashed to the stories he had seen on the news, people falsely accused, police fabricating evidence. Was this happening to him now? Or was this just a case of reckless incompetence? Either way, it didn't matter. He was stuck, helpless, and at the mercy of people who had already decided he was guilty of something. Then, one of the officers muttered something under his breath, and the other's expression shifted. Whatever they thought they had found, it changed everything. Jake's heart pounded as he watched the officers exchange looks. Something had shifted. They weren't just acting careless anymore. They looked convinced, certain that they had found what they were looking for. But found what? His prosthetic leg wasn't a hiding place. It was just a part of him, something he relied on every single day. The taller officer pulled out his radio, muttering something too low for Jake to hear. His partner, a younger cop with nervous eyes, kept turning the leg over in his hands, as if expecting something to fall out. Jake clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice sharp. "There's nothing in there. Give it back." But they weren't listening. The taller cop turned to him, his expression unreadable. "We need to take this in for further examination." The officers hesitated for half a second, but then, without a word, they started walking toward their cruiser, prosthetic leg in hand. Jake felt a surge of panic. If they drove off with it, who knew when, if ever, he'd get it back? He had to do something. He had to stop them. But how do you fight back when you can't even stand? Jake's breath was shallow as he watched the officers move toward their car. His prosthetic leg, his lifeline, was slipping away, and with it, any sense of control he had left. The crowd around him was growing, their murmurs turning into shouts. More phones were recording now, capturing every second of this outrageous scene. Then, just as the officers reached their cruiser, another voice cut through the chaos. "Hold on a second." A new figure stepped forward, a man in plain clothes, flashing a badge. His presence sent a ripple through the scene. He wasn't in uniform, but his authority was clear. The officers froze, their grip tightening on the prosthetic. Jake's pulse spiked. Who was this? Another cop? Someone higher up? For a brief moment, he thought maybe, just maybe, this was the person who would put a stop to all of this. But the look on the man's face told a different story. He wasn't here to help. His sharp eyes flicked from Jake to the officers, then to the prosthetic leg in their hands. "You were supposed to bring that to me directly," he muttered, low enough that only those closest could hear. Jake's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about some random search. There was something else at play, something bigger. And whatever it was, he was caught in the middle of it. Jake's entire body tensed as he processed what he had just heard. Bring that to me directly, This wasn't just an overreach of power. Something bigger was going on. His gut told him this had nothing to do with him personally. He was just caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly thrown off by the plainclothes man's sudden appearance. "We were just securing it," the taller cop said, his voice stiff. "Standard procedure." But the man wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No, you were stalling. Hand it over." Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He couldn't stay silent anymore. "What is going on?" "That's my leg. You're treating me like a criminal, and I still don't know why." His voice cracked with frustration, and for the first time, real doubt flickered across the younger officer's face. Then, out of nowhere, one of the bystanders shouted, "Hey, look at this." The crowd parted slightly as a woman held up her phone. The live stream she had been running had attracted hundreds of viewers, some of whom were digging into the officers' records in real time. These cops, people are saying they've done this before, seizing random stuff, claiming it's evidence. The plainclothes man's face darkened. He took a step back, suddenly aware that too many eyes were on him now. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were documenting . Realizing they were cornered, the officers hesitated. Then, with barely a word, the taller one shoved the prosthetic leg back into Jake's hands and turned toward the car. The plainclothes man shot him a sharp look, but it was too late. The moment was slipping from their control. Jake clutched his leg tightly, still shaken but refusing to back down. "You thought no one would notice," he said, his voice steady. "But now everyone does." The officers hurried into their cruiser, tires screeching as they sped away. The plainclothes man lingered for a second, his jaw clenched, before disappearing into the crowd. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but this time, the world was watching. Jake sat on the curb, his hands gripping his prosthetic leg as the last of the commotion settled. People were still talking, still shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. A few stayed behind, asking if he was okay, offering to send him the footage they had recorded. The support was overwhelming, but Jake's mind was still racing. What had just happened wasn't some random mistake, it was part of a pattern. Those cops, that plainclothes man, they were after something, and for whatever reason, they thought they'd find it in his leg, but they had failed. Not because they suddenly realized their mistake, but because too many people had been watching. If no one had spoken up, if no one had recorded, Jake knew things could have ended very differently. He took a deep breath and stood, his balance shaky but his resolve firm. This wasn't over. If those officers had done this before, how many others had been victims of the same abuse? And how many never got their voices heard? As he walked away, the weight of what had happened settled in. He had nearly lost more than just his leg. He had almost lost his right to stand up for himself. But now, the world knew the truth, and that meant everything. Jake sat on the curb, his hands gripping his prosthetic leg as the last of the commotion settled. People were still talking, still shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. A few stayed behind, asking if he was okay, offering to send him the footage they had recorded. The support was overwhelming, but Jake's mind was still racing. What had just happened wasn't some random mistake, it was part of a pattern. Those cops, that plainclothes man, they were after something, and for whatever reason, they thought they'd find it in his leg, but they had failed. Not because they suddenly realized their mistake, but because too many people had been watching. If no one had spoken up, if no one had recorded, Jake knew things could have ended very differently. He took a deep breath and stood, his balance shaky but his resolve firm. This wasn't over. If those officers had done this before, how many others had been victims of the same abuse? And how many never got their voices heard? As he walked away, the weight of what had happened settled in. He had nearly lost more than just his leg. He had almost lost his right to stand up for himself. But now the world knew the truth, and that meant everything.